Hi, this is Miss Litton, and this is my wonderful Period 1 class. Say hi.
Hi.
And we are going to move forward with discussing speciation and macroevolution. Could my youngest bio buddy please differentiate between micro and macroevolution? And I will give you a picture to do that with. Go ahead, youngest bio buddy.
Microevolution and
All right. Did you do it? Did they do a good job? All right. Microevolution is a change in allele frequencies within a population. Change in allele frequencies within a population. Macroevolution, or the origin of new species, results from the accumulation of microevolutionary change over time. Slate, tell them number 3.
Darwin avoided understanding history of species originate. This chapter is a snapshot of what a scientist is. This chapter is a snapshot of what scientists know.
Okay, and not to be too simplistic in the next 2 slides, but keep in mind, microevolution, you're still within the population. That means you could have some brown feathered birds and some black feathered birds, but they're still having sex with each other, right? Macroevolution is you have a whole new species. And so I think you can easily say this species is very different from this species. No problem. But where do we draw the line? Where did it become a new species? And then that brings us to what's called the species definition. How do you define a species? And I'm going to tell you, most scientists are not so concerned. This becomes a real sticking point, especially with some individuals who don't ascribe to the evolutionary processes. They'll say that God made all the species originally and what's here is there. Okay, but at what point do you say this is species A and this is species B? That's kind of a shadowing line, because maybe if they're right next to each other, they will mate. You don't know. If they're separated apart, maybe they would have mated if they were closer and lived next to each other. And at what point you go, okay, well, maybe this is a species and that is a species, and how do you determine that? So when you look at an organism and you say, what is a species, there are currently 24 different species concepts of what makes a species. And so we're just focusing on just a few of those species concepts. So on what is a species, I gave you taxonomists, or scientists who classify organisms into groups, and species can be defined in many different ways. So could Blue just name, what are the names of the species definitions we're using? I'm only going to talk about 4 of the 24. So just come up, look at the names right away. Go ahead, look.
Species concept,
Okay, so the morphological, when you look at morphology, you're looking at structures. You're looking at similar characteristics. When you're doing morphology, you look the same, so probably you're the same species. This is really helpful for fossils, because with fossils, you can't see colors, right? You can't see behavior that you might want to take into consideration with speciation. You're just looking at the anatomy. For asexual organisms, this is important, because part of the species definition says that they reproduce with each other. Well, if you don't reproduce at all sexually, then how do you determine what's a species or not? Because they don't have sex. And if you're using that as part of your definition, this becomes a problem. Now, when you look, I have notes for you on that one. Species are distinguished from each other by distinct physical characteristics. Physical characteristics. Okay, and then underneath that I gave you diagnostic traits helpful for paleontologists. Who are paleontologists? Fossils. Who was the father of paleontology? Cuvier. You're so smart. It is difficult because why? Oldest bio buddy, tell him, why is it so difficult? to use this species concept? All right. So let's try another concept. So this would be the evolutionary species concept. Looking back, where did you come from? So on this one, members of a species share a distinct evolutionary pathway in addition to morphological traits. So now you're not only just looking at the traits, you're looking at where they came from in order to distinguish between. So used to indicate speciation in the fossil record as well. Okay, now let's take it upgrade evolutionary and focus on what's called phylogenetics. Phylogenetics is used in classification as well. We'll be talking about that a little bit. And in phylogenetics, you let me jump. I think I put in a cladogram. Did I? Yes, I did. Okay, so in a cladogram, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. You might say in your cladogram, you might make the bottom part of this that you're mammals. So what do you have to be mammals? What? Hair and what? Mammary glands. Okay, and then you'll say from here up, everybody here has hair and they have mammary glands. But from here up, you walk on 4 legs. From here up, and you put some other differentiation in there, and you start dropping people off, you know, or organisms off as you go along the way. That is a cladogram. And so when you look at the phylogenetic species concept, you're looking at a group of organisms that have these, that's the smallest group you can find on that cladogram. That would be a population, the smallest group. Like they're separated from one, some factor is separating them off. So for phylogenetic species concept, smallest set of interbreeding organisms, usually a population, that share a common ancestor. That share a common ancestor. So it's monophyletic. What does mono mean? One. A branch of the phylogenetic tree that contains all the descendants of a common ancestor. All the descendants of a common ancestor. Now, the cool thing about this is, I gave an example of a cladogram where we looked at morphology, like these have hair and nails. These walk on 4s. These walk on 2 limbs. They can do and form a cladogram, and you will be doing this in an upcoming lab. You look at the DNA. And so you could say, well, they have all of this type of DNA. Once you don't have this trait, we're going to drop you off, and all the rest have this DNA, and all the rest have this DNA. And you look through similarities of DNA in order to design your cladogram. So that's good for that. I'm not going to beat that horse, but we will go over it a little bit later. So advantage does not rely on morphological traits, looks at DNA. Then the biological species concept, okay? I'm going to have Slate go ahead and explain the biological species concept. Go ahead. All right, so the biological species concept relies primarily on reproductive isolation to identify different species. Lack of gene flow. Relies primarily on reproductive isolation to identify species. Lack of gene flow. Meaning no new traits are flowing in or out of this group. This group only breeds with others just like it. Reproductive isolation defined as physiological, behavioral, and genetic processes that inhibit interbreeding. Physiological, what does that mean? Yeah, body shape, right? behavioral. So it could look very much, you could look very similar, but you don't know the traits or the ways to act in order to induce that breeding. Or genetic, your chromosomes don't line up. The disadvantages cannot always be tested in nature, and it cannot be applied to asexual organisms. Who just did this slide right here? Who did? Slate, okay. All right. I'll let Blue take care of this one. Go ahead. Okay, so then I wanted you to see, you'll see some other species concept, but one you know. Blue, you take the first one, biological species. It's on here. Go ahead. Okay, and then here you can see some of the other ones as well. You can see morphological up here, very common, but what do you do with cryptic species? Phylogenetic species, that was the second to the last one we just did, and its practical application is increasing anytime we use cladograms. You need to look to see when we look at numbers and we say, is this statistically significant, and we apply the what to determine that? Chi-square test. So when you look at a structure, how do you know it's important enough to include that to drop off? Like if you don't have this, you don't get to be part of our group, right? Whether that's DNA, an intron, an exon, some behavior. Do we include you in our group, or is this important enough to eliminate you from our team? So anytime you take value judgments, where you're saying this is important, this isn't important, you have to look whether something's homologous or analogous. You're making a value judgment in there, and that leaves you open for errors, right? And then there are some, and we'll look in this in taxonomy, where it's called phonetics. They'll just add up every single possible trait mathematically and say whoever has the most of these. It doesn't matter if the wings are an homologous or an analogous structure. They won't take that into consideration. So wings are wings are wings. They'll just add up every single trait, and then those that have the most things in common, then they'll put those in groupings. But there's errors there because you need to know whether it's some trait is a result of what kind of evolution is that, where you end up in the same spot? Convergent evolution. Okay, so the point here is not to muddle your mind, but to see that it's very difficult to apply when do you have a species and when don't you have a species. What you want to see here, when we talk about macroevolution, we're saying this is the evolution of a whole new species, yet we have a hard time determining what is a species. Okay, so that's this first part. But we'll end here with this form, and we'll say, Blue, why don't you take this slide? Go ahead, Blue. Blue again. I'll go Slate next time. All right, so if we're going to go with this reproduction part, okay, species that interbreed, then you would say that the way you would form a new species, because we're talking about the origin of new species, right, is we have to have some sort of reproductive isolating mechanisms. Because if you can have reproductive isolating mechanisms, then you're more likely to form a new species if you're only interbreeding with each other and there's no other gene flow with other organisms, right? So let's look at some of those reproductive isolating mechanisms. And Slate, go ahead and define what a reproductive isolating mechanism is. Go ahead. Okay, so there are pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms and post-zygotic isolating mechanisms. Pre-zygotic meaning you're not ever forming a zygote. That's pre-zygotic. Post-zygote, you actually form a zygote, but it's not working out well for the zygote. Okay, that would be a post-zygotic isolating mechanism. So we're just going to walk through these top to bottom. Keep in mind, anytime you contribute in any way time or energy or actual gametes to an unsuccessful reproductive event, do you see how that would be wasteful for your fitness? Remember, our fitness is a measure of our reproductive success, right? So anytime I spin my wheels through behavior, through my actions, making nests, the actual mating, and I'm not going to get viable offspring, that is a waste. So you have these reproductive isolating mechanisms to prevent that waste. The first one you could start out with, okay, is on your pre-zygotic mechanism, so sperm does not meet the egg. This would be at the very last moment, right? At this point, sex has happened. So where can we prevent this from occurring earlier on? The first way would be with habitat isolation. I live on the tops of the leaves. You live on the bottoms of the leaves. So we're not near each other. Or right? So our habitats where we live, we're not next to each other, so therefore we don't have sex. So on your notes, go to habitat isolation. Even within the same geographic range. And then I said think forest canopy. If you've studied rainforest before, they're at different levels of the canopy. So I'm at the tops of the trees, you're at the bottoms of the trees. That would be habitat isolation. The next one, let's say we live in the exact same habitat. We are on the same level of the canopy. So that's not isolating us. We are actually near each other. So then you have temporal isolation. What do you hear in temporal? I think what? Time. Okay? You're thinking temperature? Okay. All right. So why aren't these frogs who are living in the same pond, they're sharing the same habitat, why aren't they mating? Slate, go again. I got to make up for that. Go ahead. Why aren't they mating? All right, so temporal isolation, they're mating at different times or at different locations within that habitat that they share. Some are mating on the edge of the pond, some are mating in the pond. James Pond. Okay, now, so what was the first isolating mechanism? Your what? Habitat. So we don't live near each other. That's why we're not having sex. You live in Agora, they live in Oak Park. Okay, so they're in different habitats, okay? Now let's say you both live in Oak Park, okay? Temporal isolation, and you both live in Oak Park, one of you only mates in the spring, and one of you only mates in the fall. That would be temporal isolation. Okay, so now let's say you both live in Oak Park, and you both mate in the spring. Okay, why aren't you, what would keep you apart? What kind of reproductive isolating mechanism would you have? It could be behavioral. Okay, you are not acting in a way that would make me want to have sex with you. Okay, so it could be two crabs on the beach and they're living in the same habitat. They have sex at the same time of year, but behaviorally, when one wants to have sex, they like wave their claw in the air, and this means I am so ready. And the other one goes, okay? And so they're sitting there, and the one is horny as hell, just going, meh, and the other one, but they don't know that they're saying and signaling to each other, let's go, okay? They don't know that because they have different behaviors. Yes?
So I just thought about it because of habitat. Like, I know with salmon, like, they mate where they were going some long, like, migration.
Journey.
Yeah. So, like, wouldn't that originally be habitat isolated, but then they move to the place where they're not? Or
No, salmon will always mate in their home stream, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about like salmon having sex with bass, though. That doesn't happen because they live in a different habitat, right? Okay. All right. So behavior isolation, let's write something down for that. Pheromones, dances, or calls isolate. The dance. You don't dance very well. I can't have sex with you. All right. The next one. Let's say we live in the same habitat. We want to have sex at the same time, and you got all the right moves. What would prevent them from having sex? So the next one is mechanical isolation. The parts don't fit together. Okay? You guys, and don't, if you write an essay on this, I had somebody goes, a fly doesn't have sex with a dog because their parts won't fit. Really? You dumb donkey? I am wasting my time reading this essay? I just was like, okay? So don't say something stupid like that, okay? No offense, okay? But there are, for dragonflies, for example, they have claspers, and their claspers to hold the female only work on their same species, okay? The claspers are like, get busy with, okay? And so that is another way of having reproductive isolation, because these different species are all living in the same habitat. They all want to have sex at the same time. They all have the right behaviors, but then when they go to actually perform the deed, they can't because their claspers don't work, okay? So that would be a form of mechanical isolation. Inaccessibility. Oh, another one is pollen. Did I have that picture right here? Oh, no, I don't. You could think pollen or clasper issues. So pollen would be that if the pollen is somehow not able to stick or get together with that particular flower, if you're looking at a plant. Then the last one, and this is the pollen example that I have, is one species of plant can prevent the pollen tube formation from occurring. So you actually do have sex, but it can't, this is gamete isolation, the two gametes at the very last moment can't get together. It's like the pollen tube, no, okay? And so this act, they're actually wasted their pollen on one that could not receive that particular sperm. The thing that's okay, it doesn't wipe out plants because they produce so much pollen. It's gonna land on your car, it's gonna land on you, it's gonna land on some of the wrong plants. They make up for that deficit of not being specific by volume of gametes that they generate. So gametic isolation, gametes may not fuse to form a zygote. All right, so we talked about pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms, things that get in the way before you make the zygote. Now let's say the sperm and the egg actually meet and you still form a zygote. Okay, so now that, what are some ways that would still maintain reproductive isolation? It could be that the sperm does fertilize the egg, but then the embryo does not completely develop. Okay, so you have hybrid inviability. It's not developing well at all. Or it does develop, but it's sterile. So you're not, fine, you had sex and you produced an offspring, but it can't produce any offspring. Or the very last line of this is, let's say you produce an offspring, it's not sterile, nobody wants to have sex with you because you're different, okay? Or you're weak, okay? Don't look at your brother, okay? So they have reduced fertility. So on post-zygotic isolating mechanisms, these are after formation of a zygote. After formation of a zygote. So hybrid inviability, zygote cannot develop properly. Cannot develop properly. Or hybrid sterility, and then you could think mule. Okay? So a horse and a donkey could produce a mule that is sterile. Now, It depends on who the female is. If the female is the horse or the female is the donkey. And some mules aren't sterile. Not all mules are. We had a mule that was not sterile. So fancy. And so it's not always, but then sometimes other organisms don't want to mate with it. So sometimes they mate, but the F2 hybrids have reduced fitness. And here, these are two cats, like in the wild, not one you could have. And their offspring can't survive even if they mate. So that would be an example of zygote mortality. And then here, it's possible like you could have mules mate, but then their offspring don't survive. All right, now we're going to ping pong through them, and we'll start with the youngest bio buddy. We'll take the top one, and I have a couple of slides, and just alternate through each one of them and just explain it as you go.
For mechanical isolation, can you say that like one genitalia is not
How did we group these together? Yeah, we grouped these underneath habitat. Okay? I just want you to be able to apply it to new situations. Did you go through those? Okay, keep going. Okay, and you guys want me to chunk this, so like break this one off and then we'll restart again? Okay. Oh, so hope this was helpful. If this is late at night, have a piece of toast. Yeah. Make good decisions.